Good morning, people. This is now a reassessment based on the mapping that's been done by the ARC and also a recalculation of how much water trees use, which probably had a bigger effect on the results than the other one. I would just like to acknowledge also my co-authors, Greg Forsyth, who did a lot of the calculation work, Sebenasi Zakiki and Mark Gash, who gave me a lot of input in trying to come up with better models for the water use. Yeah, that's good. Just a quick outline, introduction, talking about some of the basic requirements for a model, some progress that's been made in the interim, then some of the results, summary and conclusion. The last national level assessment of impact was published in 1998, Baseball study. The total area invaded was 10.08 million hectares, the condensed equivalent was 1.7 million hectares, and the reduction in mean annual runoff came to about 3,300 million cubic meters per year, or almost 7% of pre-development runoff. In other words, how much runoff we had in this country before we started irrigating and putting more water into cities and mines, etc. It was based on a single biomass model which worked in millimeters. So even if there wasn't actually that much water in the catchment, the model would predict that you could use that much water. The second important concept to understand with the model is that the model works in terms of incremental flow change. So what Water Affairs and everyone is planning around is how much water flow has changed from the original condition. So when we talk about the amounts of water, it's a relative amount of water. So that 3,300 million cubic meters per year across the country is the difference between what the natural vegetation would have used and what the aliens used. It's important to understand that because you have to have some base reference to work from. You can't presume that what was there didn't use any water. Right, and so obviously the model was crude, and then also the mapping was crude. We had a lot of expectations of what we could map and couldn't map, and it turned out it went not half as good as we thought, but it at least gave us a picture. Was this a big problem or a small problem? But obviously an update was desperately needed. In terms of the hydrology in particular, the model should be conceptually correct and simple because you're trying to work across an enormous range of species and you're trying to work across a range of growth forms. You're dealing with a degree of cover. You're not dealing with actual things like leaf area, which are much easier to relate to water use. And you're also working with dryland versus riparian situations. So trees that are growing in river situations use a lot more water than trees, the same species growing just outside that riverine situation. And we've got a lot of data in the interim to show that. So it's also one of the reasons why, going back decades, forestry has been strongly regulated and forestry were not permitted to plant within certain distances of streams. It's because of that, in known fact, the trees use more water. The other thing we have to deal with is we have a very wide range of climatic conditions across the country, from winter rainfall to summer rainfall, from very high rainfall to near desert. We also had to be able to use readily available data, and it had to be appropriate for working for water regional scale and for national scale analysis. It's not intended to be used, you're not supposed to go and say, this is precisely what's happening in my quaternary catchment. That's neither the aim of the mapping of the invasions or the aim of this exercise. So if we talk about species and growth forms, you obviously have a huge variety. That's Acacia saligna on the Cape Flats. This is a river with eucalyptus growing along it. This is poplars growing up against the cliff in the Free State. Often poplars were planted on springs because people wanted wood to make roof beams with, and there wasn't anything else straight enough and grew fast enough to replace poplar. Wattles along rivers, Donax, about which you've heard quite a bit, in the Hayes River, and here a mixture of Hakea and pines on the Fertility estate. We also had to be able to deal with variability across landscapes, and I'm quite glad I included this after Francis's talk yesterday, because this shows very nicely how evaporation, there on that scale, up to about 1,200 millimeters a year down to zero, varies across this landscape in the Western Cape. So this actually is the Berg River, going all the way down here, and you can see how it's been picked out as having high evaporation, even though this is quite coarse resolution data. This river system here stands out clearly, as does the Pilbara Valley and some of these other areas. But we need to be able to deal with this kind of heterogeneity in the landscape in some way or other. So what was the progress in the interim? First of all, we refined the original biomass model. So It still works largely with growth form categories, but we now work with proportional flow reductions. So if there's not that much water in the landscape, you can't use more than it because you can only go to 100%. We also deal with dry land and riparian in a more sensible way than we did before, and that recognizing that the dry land availability, the water availability, that incremental flow reduction is that mean annual runoff. You can't use more than that, except maybe in very limited areas. The riparian, water availability is generally greater than MAR. They're growing along the river, even if it's a seasonally dry river, there's still water in that riverbed to use, especially for deep-rooted trees. And then we've collected a lot of additional data. I'm not going to go into that, but there's a table in the report that I'm working on which documents that. But there's quite a lot of information. Again, not enough information by any means to make me really happy, but a lot more information than we had in 1998. And then we also have the new mapping of invasions, which at least it's applied a consistent approach. It has focused on the moister part of South Africa, as I'll show you in a minute. And it's also mapped a limited number of taxa. We had about 180 taxa that we mapped in the first half work, and this one is focused on a limited number, but they are the key water users by and large. So what do the results look like? Well, here first of all is the mapping that was done for this National Invasive Alien Plant Survey, just in case you're worried about the money. And this shows the primary catchments around the country, in other words, the key drainage areas, which also form by and large the basis of the water management areas that we're looking forward to work that Maitre-Nationally work with. And what's important here is to pick up they did not include the Kruger Park in part of their mapping. And this here boundary basically divides the arid regions of the country from the moist regions of the country, except largely for this section of the upper coast. So this is the area that was actually mapped. This area was not included in the map. It's important to bear that in mind, especially with some of the later figures, where we get quite startling amounts of invasion for this catchment here and this catchment here, despite the fact that only a proportion, a very small proportion, for example, of the Orange River system was actually mapped. So what do the reductions look like when we've been through all this exercise? This is a percentage reduction. And you can see that it varies a lot between quaternary catchments, but one of the key things that comes out of this is still the Western Cape down here has obviously been quite heavily affected. The catchments in the Knysna Titicaca area come out, largely because of pine invasions in the mountains, come out as having a large effect. And also up the east coast, we always knew that we didn't map particularly the former Transkei and that part of the Eastern Cape very well, but now this mapping of the Kotze has confirmed that. And also that the southern part of KwaZulu-Natal and the northern part are more invaded than we mapped with the original Fairscale data, and I'll show you the comparison in a moment. But one of the things that does stand out is we're still looking at quite high reductions. Even though I'll discuss in a minute why it's lower and what the numbers are, we're still looking at catchments where we effectively reduced the runoff by more than 25% of that original number. If you place that in the context of the fact that we're actually using a lot more of the water from those catchments now, it actually becomes quite a significant effect. And one of the next stages for this analysis is actually to try and look at what are the implications for yields from our dam systems in the country. So here I've put up a comparison. So this shows the Fairscale on the top and the new data at the bottom. This is in terms of the condensed area, how much area was invaded. If you take the 100 hectares as 75% invaded, it's equivalent to 75 hectares 100% invaded. Mathematically, obviously not physically, but mathematically. So it makes a convenient way of comparison. So this is the condensed area. And some of these, obviously these catchments are different sizes and different degrees of them are mapped. So basically, what we do find is that some of the areas shown by Fairscale as being more heavily invaded than are shown by Kotze. Part of that was that we overestimated in the Fairscale particularly how much of the Eucalyptus plain was invaded. There was a lot more that had been converted to farmland, which people mapped as invaded than we realized at the time. But basically what you see is that there's still some very high reductions predicted by Fairscale. This was largely because this is a very dry area, and we had mapped quite extensive invasions of Acacia cyclops on the coast, so they had a big apparent effect on the runoff. I don't think they really did actually physically have that effect. But that's just the way the numbers came out. But what we show is that there's quite a low degree of impact in this part of the country, whereas the new data show very clearly that there's been a big shift. So the Western Cape still stands out as quite a highly impacted area, both in terms of area and reduction, but the eastern part of the country is now showing up as much more invaded than it did before. So that's one of the key shifts, and this obviously has an implication for how Working for Water distribute their money nationally, because water is one of the key drivers in their prioritization. Then if we look at the biomes, which is an area that we're interested in trying to understand in terms of prioritization of our biomes, we can see clearly that the grassland biome is heavily affected, but also that only about half of the grassland biome has been mapped. So it's an important area to address. So if we look at the biome figures, Albany Thicket is actually quite surprisingly invaded. Our forests are quite highly invaded percentage-wise, which may be a result, partly at least, of the resolution of the data. But the one that comes out worst is the grasslands, with an enormous extent of invasions. And if you bear in mind that already about half of that has been mapped, and that's mostly the higher rainfall, higher yielding areas, it tells you that we actually potentially are having quite a significant effect. The other one that comes up with a very extensive area is savanna, because the savannas are so extensive in this country, the percentage is quite low. The biggest reduction, again, as I said, is in the grasslands, which is quite important. So we're looking at a 3.7%, but it's 3.7% of that amount of runoff, so it's a considerable amount of runoff. So the effects are still large. Then, if we look at the species, the Acacia, mearnsii, dealbata, and the currants were mapped by Ian and Co. as a group, and they still stand out as the worst invaders. They were the worst invaders in the Fatsveld data as well, accounting for 483 million cubic meters of water out of a total of about 1.4, so that's about a third of this total reduction. And their average reduction is about 108 millimeters. That's if you express it on an area basis. So clearly the Acacia, mearnsii and allies come up, pines come up, mainly because they're in high rainfall, high yielding catchments. Eucalyptus species come out. A lot of them are riparian invaders, but quite a lot is not. We hadn't realized before this that eucalyptus were quite as much of a problem in the country as they are, it seems. And then other species, Chromolina is a very high water user, according to what we've been able to, according to our studies. Hakea again occurs in high rainfall areas, but we're getting down to relatively small numbers. It's these guys up here that are really accounting for a huge proportion of what's happening in the country. So if we summarize then, first of all, the total condensed area about 1.7, total reduction about 3,200 million cubic meters a year, which if I remember right is about 75% of the original runoff of the Vaal River, the entire Vaal River system. It's about 190 millimeters a year, or 1,900 cubic meters a hectare per year. And most invasions we found were in the Western Cape. This, a recent re-evaluation, is about 1.5 million hectares that's been invaded on a condensed area basis. Total reduction about 1.4 million, or 2.8% of MAR, which is equivalent to about 97, and that's the key reason why this figure is so much lower than that. There is a reduction in area, and what we're also finding is most of the invasions are on the eastern Cape of KwaZulu-Natal and Mpumalanga. So clearly this estimate is much more conservative than Fatsveld's. We believe that we are underestimating the riparian invasions, and I still need to do some more calculations on that. Semi-arid and arid areas were excluded, which includes the riparian invasions in those areas, and anyone who's been up in the Northern Cape and looked at the Vaal River, Orange River system would just see it. Stacked of invasions, great invasives going on there. But even this reduced impact is still a substantial impact in a water-scarce country. And the invasions have not stopped increasing, and they won't stop increasing. So the less we do about it, the more of a problem we'll have to deal with in the future. It's not like something we can fix a dam and get more water, because if the water isn't getting in the dam in the first place, you have problems. And then lastly, just thanks to colleagues and co-authors, and also to Working for Water for funding this study. Thank you.
Thanks, David. We have probably half a minute for one question.
Question and a point. Is there any evidence of Working for Water's clearance in your mapping data? And then while I've got the floor, the biocontrollers were all saying, shall we carry on with the old cherries like Provolina and Montana? I think your data there says absolutely there's the list.
Yes.
Those are the plants we should be working with.
Right. On the first point, we did do publish a paper with Brian last year, and Ian and others, in which we said that no, we don't think working for water is doing the wrong things, but working for water is not making enough of a difference. And actually, we really need, as a country, to stop sitting around in this attitude of working for water will fix it. Working for water is not able to fix it. We, as citizens, farmers, landowners in the country, we actually need to get engaged in this problem and dealing with this problem. It's not just something that working for water can do.
Thank you, David.